The overhead bin slammed shut like a coffin lid, and Ronald Wilson felt every pair of eyes in first class boring into the back of his rumpled shirt. Seat 11F, economy, where people like them belonged. The woman in 2A didn't even glance up from her tablet, her manicured nails dancing across the screen as if swatting away insects. But in 72 hours, that same woman would be standing in a Pentagon briefing room, and Ronald's name would make a 3-star general's face go pale as winter snow. The question was simple. How does a broke single dad in a borrowed suit end up holding the key to a military crisis that could reshape everything? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Ronald Wilson had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. Not ugly, not handsome, just there. 42 years old with tired eyes. His daughter, Lindsay, was 7, gap-toothed, with her mother's dark curls and his own habit of chewing her bottom lip when nervous. She was chewing it now. The flight attendant pointed toward their row with the mechanical smile of someone who'd pointed at 10,000 rows before this one. Seat 11F sat beside the window. 12E was middle. Ronald had bought the tickets on a credit card that was already screaming for mercy, using miles he'd been hoarding like a dragon, guarding copper coins instead of gold. They were flying to Washington, D.C. for Lindsay's medical consultation. The doctors in Portland had used words like specialized and experimental and out-of-network, which was just a fancy way of saying his insurance covered approximately nothing. But Dr. Christina Taylor at Johns Hopkins had agreed to see Lindsay. Pro bono. Because sometimes the universe remembered that decent people existed. Ronald's phone buzzed. A text from his sister. "Did you make the flight? Call me when you land." "Love you both." He powered it down. Airplane mode. The rules were rules, even for people whose lives were held together with duct tape and hope. The woman from 2A appeared in his peripheral vision, gliding down the aisle like a shark through water. Clara Hastings. He knew her name because it was embossed on the leather portfolio tucked under her arm. CEO of something, probably everything. She wore a suit and her perfume smelled like money, if money smelled like jasmine and casual cruelty. She stopped at row 12. Ronald's stomach dropped. He checked his boarding pass again. 11F, but she was looking at 12D, across the aisle, where a college kid sat scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me," Clara said. Not a question, a statement. The kid looked up, confused. "You're in my associate's seat." She gestured to a nervous-looking man hovering behind her, clutching a briefcase like a shield. "I need him beside me. You're going to have to move." The kid blinked. "I paid for this seat, and I'm sure the airline can compensate you, perhaps a voucher." Her smile was thinner than paper. Ronald watched this unfold the way you watch a car accident in slow motion. The kid eventually moved to a middle seat 4 rows back, and Clara's associate settled in like a trained dog. She didn't thank him, didn't thank the kid. Just returned to first class, heels clicking like a countdown. Lindsay tugged his sleeve. "Is that lady mean?" "She's just busy." "Sweetheart," Ronald lied, because what else do you tell a 7-year-old about the way the world works? The plane pushed back from the gate. The safety video played on screens nobody watched. Ronald felt the familiar knot in his chest, the one that had lived there since Christina died 3 years ago. Since the cancer had eaten through her like acid, leaving him with a mortgage, medical debt that could crush a tank, and a little girl who still sometimes called for her mama in the middle of the night. He closed his eyes as the engines roared to life. What Ronald didn't know, couldn't know, was that Clara Hastings had just received an encrypted email on her tablet. The subject line read, "Project Nightfall. Immediate attention required." And buried in the classified attachments was a personnel file she'd glance at in exactly 47 minutes when the seatbelt sign dinged off and she needed something to review before her Pentagon meeting. A file with a name she'd heard before. Years ago, in a context that made her pulse quicken even now. The flight was smooth. Too smooth. The kind of smooth that makes your teeth ache waiting for turbulence. Lindsay drew pictures on a napkin. A house, a tree, a dog they couldn't afford. Ronald had packed sandwiches from home, peanut butter and jelly in Ziploc bags. He unwrapped one and handed it to Lindsay, who accepted it without complaint. She was a good kid. Better than he deserved. Across the aisle, Clara's associate typed furiously on a laptop, occasionally leaning over to show her something. Ronald caught fragments of their conversation through the white noise of the cabin. "The timeline is impossible," the associate said. "Then make it possible." Clara's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "We have the contract. We deliver, or we lose everything. But the testing phase is complete enough. Move to implementation." Ronald tuned them out. Rich people problems. He had enough of his own. The flight attendant came by with the beverage cart. Lindsay asked for apple juice. Ronald ordered coffee. Black, because it was free. The woman in the window seat of their row, an elderly lady with kind eyes and a rosary wrapped around her wrist, offered Lindsay a stick of gum. "For the ears," she said softly. "When we land." Lindsay looked at Ronald for permission. He nodded. And Lindsay accepted the gum with a whispered, "Thank you," that made the old woman's whole face light up. "Beautiful daughter," she said to Ronald. "Thank you." The words came automatically, but the pride behind them was real. Lindsay was beautiful. Christina's beauty, living on. The old woman smiled and returned to her book, a thick paperback romance with a shirtless man on the cover. Ronald's phone was off, tucked in his pocket, but he found himself patting it anyway, a nervous habit. The phone held his entire life, Lindsay's medical records, insurance information that wasn't worth the digital space it occupied, photos of Christina that he looked at when Lindsay was asleep and the house got too quiet. It also held something else, something he hadn't thought about in years, his DD-214, military discharge papers. Buried in a folder labeled Old Stuff, because what else do you call a life you've left behind? The seatbelt sign chimed off. People stood, stretched, formed lines at the bathrooms. Clara remained in first class, her tablet glowing like a nuclear reactor. She swiped through the classified files with the efficiency of someone who'd been granted security clearance, so high it required its own security clearance. Project Nightfall was her baby. Her company, Hastings Defense Solutions, had won the contract over 7 competitors, each one hungry enough to kill for it. The project was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. An AI-driven tactical response system designed to interface with F-19 Crows during combat situations. It would process data faster than any human, make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and pilots in body bags. But the system had a problem. During the final test run at Nellis Air Force Base, something had gone wrong. The AI had frozen during a simulated dogfight scenario, leaving the pilot vulnerable for exactly 4.3 seconds. In real combat, that was a lifetime. That was death. Clara's team insisted it was a fluke, a corrupted data packet, nothing that couldn't be fixed with a patch and another round of testing. But the Pentagon was nervous. The generals were asking questions, and questions led to delays, which led to contract reviews, which led to competitors circling like vultures. She needed this to work. Her company's entire future balanced on this single project, like a piano on a rope. Her associate leaned over. "The briefing is scheduled for Friday at 0900. Secretary Billy will be there personally." "Good." Clara didn't look up from the tablet. "Make sure the demonstration is flawless. I want every senator in that room to see what we've built." "What about the freeze issue?" "What freeze issue?" She met his eyes. The system performed within acceptable parameters. Any anomalies were within the margin of error for beta testing. The associate swallowed. Understood. Back in 11F, Lindsay had fallen asleep against Ronald's shoulder, her breathing soft and rhythmic. The old woman in the window seat smiled at them. "Your first time in D.C.?" she asked. "Yeah," Ronald said quietly, trying not to wake Lindsay. "Medical appointment." The woman's smile faded into something gentler. "I'll say a prayer for you both." "Thank you." He meant it. "You have that look," she continued, "like you've carried heavy things." Ronald almost laughed. If she only knew. The crushing weight of single parenthood, the medical bills that bred like rabbits, the shame of food stamps and charity and accepting his sister's money, even though she had 2 kids of her own to feed. But there were heavier things he'd carried too. Things from before. When his name wasn't just Ronald Wilson, unremarkable civilian. When his call sign was painted on the side of an F-16, and he'd flown missions over mountains whose names were still classified. He'd been good at it. Flying. Better than good. The kind of pilot who made instructors shake their heads in disbelief, who could feel the aircraft like an extension of his own body. Viper, they'd called him, because he was fast and deadly and absolutely precise. Until the day he wasn't. The old woman was still watching him with those knowing eyes. Ronald looked away, focusing on Lindsay's sleeping face instead. "We all carry things," he finally said. She nodded and returned to her book. Somewhere in first class, Clara opened a personnel file attached to the Project Nightfall documents. It was marked Historical Context, Original Test Pilot Program. She almost skipped it. Ancient history wasn't her concern. But something made her pause. The file was from 12 years ago, a pilot evaluation for the initial F-19 combat systems integration. Top scores across the board. Reaction times that bordered on superhuman. A glowing recommendation from a colonel who rarely glowed about anything. The pilot's name was Captain Ronald Wilson. Call sign, Viper. Clara's eyes narrowed. She kept reading. 2 years into the program, Captain Wilson had been grounded following an incident during a training exercise. The details were redacted, but the outcome was clear. Medical discharge, honorable. He'd walked away from the Air Force and disappeared into civilian life. She made a note in her tablet. Cross-reference Wilson against current personnel databases. Determine if relevant to Nightfall contingencies. Then she closed the file and moved on. Old pilots were a dime a dozen. Washed-up Hazebians who couldn't hack it. She needed people who could deliver results now, not nostalgia for glory days. But something itched at the back of her mind. A detail she couldn't quite place. The name Wilson felt familiar beyond the file. She'd figure it out later. Right now, she had a company to save. The plane began its descent into Reagan National. The skyline of D.C. emerged through the clouds like a postcard from a country Ronald barely recognized anymore. Monuments and power. Marble and secrets. Lindsay woke up, rubbing her eyes. "Are we there?" "Almost, sweetheart." The landing was smooth. Applause rippled through the cabin from the tourists, who still thought clapping for pilots was a thing. Ronald gathered their belongings. One backpack, one small suitcase with wheels that stuck. Lindsay's stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. They filed off the plane with the rest of economy, shuffling through the jetway into the terminal. That's when Ronald heard it. A voice over the airport intercom, calm but urgent. "Attention, this is an emergency announcement. All military personnel currently in the terminal. Please report to the United Airlines gate desk immediately. Repeat. All military personnel to United gate desk immediately." Ronald froze. Around him, people muttered and checked their phones. A few men and women in various uniforms, Army, Navy, Air Force, changed direction and headed toward the gate desk with quick, purposeful strides. Lindsay tugged his hand. "Daddy?" "It's okay," he said automatically. But it wasn't okay. That kind of announcement meant something bad. Something big. Ronald's instincts, The ones he'd spent 3 years trying to bury, kicked in like muscle memory. He guided Lindsay to a seat near their gate and told her to wait, just for 1 minute, while he found out what was happening. He approached the gate desk, where a cluster of personnel had gathered. A Marine captain was speaking with the gate agent, who looked pale and shaken. "What's going on?" Ronald asked. The Marine glanced at him. "Are you military?" "Was. Air Force. Discharged." "Then this doesn't concern you." The Marine turned back to the agent. But Ronald heard enough of the conversation to understand. There'd been an incident. A training exercise over the Chesapeake had gone wrong. 2 F-19s had experienced simultaneous system failures, complete electrical shutdown. Both pilots had ejected safely, but the aircraft were gone, $200 million each sinking into the bay like stones. And here was the part that made Ronald's blood run cold. The failures had occurred during a demonstration of a new AI tactical system. The same system that was supposed to be revolutionary. The same system that Clara Hastings was probably betting her entire company on. Project Nightfall had just killed 2 crows. Ronald backed away from the desk, his mind racing. He returned to Lindsay, who was playing with her rabbit, blissfully unaware. "Everything okay?" The old woman from their row had appeared beside them, concern etched in her face. "Yeah," Ronald lied. "Just a delay for some folks." But his hands were shaking. Across the terminal, Clara Hastings stepped off the plane and immediately checked her phone. 7 missed calls, 12 texts, all from the same number. Her Pentagon liaison. She called back. "We have a problem," the voice said without preamble. 2 birds down. Nightfall experienced catastrophic integration failure. The demonstration is canceled, and Secretary Billy wants answers yesterday. Clara's face remained perfectly composed, but her knuckles went white around the phone. "I'm en route to the office now. Assemble the team. We'll identify the failure point and have a solution before the weekend." "Clara, they're talking about terminating the contract. This isn't a patch situation. This is a fundamental flaw." "Then we fix the fundamentals. I'll call you back in 30 minutes. She hung up and stood perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds, allowing herself that moment to feel the fear. Then she locked it away and started walking. She needed someone who understood these systems at a level beyond coding and simulations. Someone who'd actually flown these aircraft in combat conditions. Someone who could think like a pilot and engineer simultaneously. Someone like the man in that old personnel file. Viper. The name suddenly clicked into place. She'd heard it at a defense conference years ago. Some old-timer colonel telling war stories over bourbon. "Best damn pilot I ever saw," he'd said. "Could have been legendary if he hadn't washed out." Clara pulled up her assistant on speed dial. "I need you to locate someone. Former Air Force Captain Ronald Wilson. Call sign Viper. Last known residence Portland, Oregon. Current whereabouts unknown. Find him. Immediately." On it. She hung up and continued toward baggage claim. What Clara didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that Ronald Wilson wasn't in Portland anymore. He was 50 feet behind her, holding his daughter's hand, walking toward the same baggage carousel, living the same air as her for the first time since she'd dismissed his existence in seat 2A. The universe has a wicked sense of timing. Ronald collected their suitcase and headed for the taxi stand. The medical appointment was tomorrow morning. Tonight, they'd check into the cheap hotel he'd found online, the one with the broken ice machine and the continental breakfast that was just stale bagels and coffee. But as they stepped outside into the humid DC evening, Ronald saw something that made him stop dead. 3 men in dress blues stood near a black SUV. Officers. Their insignia caught the light. Major, Lieutenant Colonel, Full Colonel. The colonel was scanning the crowd like he was searching for someone. Their eyes met. The colonel's face went from neutral to shocked in half a second. He walked over quickly, purpose in every step. Viper? Ronald Wilson? Ronald's throat went dry. Colonel Stephen. I'll be damned. Stephen looked older, grayer, but his handshake was still crushing. What the hell are you doing here? Medical appointment for my daughter. You? Stephen's expression darkened. We just lost 2 F-19s to a systems failure, the kind of failure that should be impossible. We're trying to figure out what the hell happened before more birds drop out of the sky. Ronald felt Lindsay pressing against his leg, nervous around the stranger. He put a protective hand on her shoulder. I'm out of the game, Colonel. Have been for years. I know. I signed your discharge papers, remember? Stephen paused, seeming to wrestle with something. But I also remember that you were the best systems integration pilot we ever had. You could feel when something was wrong before the instruments even registered it. We need that instinct right now. I can't. I'm not asking you to fly. I'm asking you to consult. 2 hours. Tomorrow. Just look at the data. Tell us what you see. That's it. Ronald wanted to say no. Should have said no. But there was something in Stephen's voice that hit the old frequency. Brothers in arms. The kind of bond that doesn't dissolve just because you put on civilian clothes. 2 hours, Ronald heard himself say, after my daughter's appointment. Stephen nodded, relief obvious. Thank you. I'll have a car pick you up. He handed Ronald a card with a number. 1400 hours. Pentagon, East Entrance. Then he was gone, back to the SUV, which pulled away into DC traffic. Lindsay looked up at Ronald. Who was that? An old friend, sweetheart, from Daddy's work before you were born. Are you in trouble? No, baby, I'm not in trouble. But he wasn't sure he believed it. The next morning, Dr. Taylor gave Lindsay good news. The experimental treatment showed promise, and they could start the protocol within a month. Ronald felt like he could breathe for the first time in weeks. At 1400 hours, he walked into a Pentagon briefing room and saw the data from the F-19 failures. It took him exactly 8 minutes to spot what the engineers had missed, a timing conflict in the AI's decision tree architecture that created microsecond delays. Harmless in simulation, catastrophic in flight. Clara Hastings sat across the table, her face unreadable as this unremarkable man in a borrowed suit explained how to save her company. She didn't recognize him from the plane. Why would she? He'd been invisible then. But when Colonel Stephen introduced him, "This is Captain Wilson. Call sign Viper, the best pilot I ever commanded." She understood exactly who she'd dismissed in Seat 2A. The man who'd just saved Project Nightfall. Sometimes the people you overlook are exactly the ones holding the answers. And sometimes the universe arranges things so perfectly, you'd swear it was planned all along. Ronald Wilson flew home 3 days later with Lindsay, back to their small life in Portland. But his phone now held a new contact, Clara Hastings, who'd offered him a consulting position that could finally dig them out of debt. He hadn't decided yet. Some wounds heal better in quiet places, away from the roar of jet engines and the weight of impossible decisions. But for the first time in 3 years, Ronald Wilson felt like more than just a shadow moving through other people's lives. He felt seen,